Good morning, George. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Kate, and good morning, Martine. Thank you for having me. And thank you to Soul Advisor for creating this opportunity for the authors that are associated with Soul Advisor to share their experiences during this July book month.
Well, it's our joy, actually. And I think, to have the capacity to bring books alive by interviewing people like you, all the authors and the practitioners that have put their life's work onto a page, um, is just such a privilege, really.
And, yep, and as a self-published author, being able to have this opportunity to get to a wider audience is also very gratefully appreciated.
We were just talking about how very hard it is to reach out and start real conversations, but the thing is that even if people just get a smidgen of it, or if they see it on our social media posts and it triggers something and that leads to a new thought, well, I guess that's what we're all doing, just really trying to thicken the field of traditional complementary integrative healthcare.
Yeah, because it goes beyond me as the individual person. It's being able to reach other people based on the insights and clinical experiences that I've experienced with the positive outcomes that I've had with clients to be able to share that to help to improve, the wellness and vitality of every person on planet Earth.
Go, George, go.
That's my overall vision as I've moved along this 35-year pathway.
And I was listening to an American podcast today, on my way down. I've just driven for 4 hours, and the person's pronunciation was very American. And rather than saying trajectory, which is what we say, she was saying trajectory. And
Okay.
I was like, oh, that sounds bad. It sounds like, we're on this trajectory of hurtling forward to our doom. It was a very interesting kind of way to put it. But definitely this your 35 years, Martine's, however long, I don't know how long you've been in the field, Martine, my own 45 years in the field, etc. All of this is like little bits that add together to an incredible body of knowledge. So I'm really looking forward to sharing your knowledge, George, right now. Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to sharing with it to the best of my ability today.
I want to ask you about this incredibly beautiful cover. And thank you for it. It's probably better that you hold it up because mine's only on breaking beta. And it's very dendritic, but it looks like trees, it looks like cells, it looks like neural pathways, and, the whole microcosm to the macrocosm concept. So tell me about that artwork. How did that come about?
Well, they came through my journey of trying to do something myself, and I realized I didn't have the skill base to do a book cover design, let alone create the whole book design in itself. And I went searching for a person that could help me with that process, and I came across a website called Reedsy, and Reedsy,
Hmm.
and they bring authors like myself, self-publishing authors, with verified editors and proofreaders and book designers and the like, and they ask you to put in what your requirements are, and you start finding people. And there was a particular lady that I saw that read her bio, and I put her into my quotation list, and her name is Raquel, and she's in Chile. So she's a Venezuelan living in Chile,
What a wonderful
and
world.
it's without this technology, there's no way I would have come across this lady, and she was amazing and amazing. She was really keen to listen to what my book was about, what I was about, and that's her design after our conversations.
Mm. It's a beautiful design. I love it. It just
Yes.
speaks to everything. And also talking about my 4 hour journey this morning, I was tuning into an incredible speaker, a Canadian woman who's been writing about the fact that our hair follicles are actually antenna. And they're not only antenna, they don't receive, but they also emit. And there's been awful lot of research done on that, and she was talking about the commonality of dendritic impulse, that is not only with our antenna as hair, but as our bodies, as humans, as trees talking to each other, which this really looks like, trees
Mm.
to each other. I know it's cells probably. It's a universal principle, isn't it? That dendritic reaching out.
Well, initially the cover was about trees. So it was like looking up at a canopy. But the way that she created it had that other interpretation of being like dendrites and neurons. And it fits in really well with the book because one of the observations that I made in my clinical experiences with clients that have been experiencing chronic pain,
Mm,
despite being stuck in that cycle, when I was asking them to think about positive experiences that they've had in their life, the one thing that I found that always brought about a very similar response across the board with everyone who I asked was a time in nature.
mm,
And nature could mean, a beach for someone, or it could be hiking through a forest, or it could be in their backyard with their little cat and a tree that they love.
mm,
And it's diverse what people perceive as nature, but the same response was being emitted or being communicated to me.
mm,
Um, and I found that through my readings that this is just not a random response.
mm,
It actually opens us or connects us to something deeper within us. And I refer to that as our innate thriving state. And I refer to that in my book as that. And it's a state that is one of pure joy,
mm,
connection,
mm,
um, and calm, or that sense of peace.
mm,
And even though some of the people with chronic pain tapped into it and only last for a minute or two, the fact that they could get to it means there was something there for them,
mm,
but it was already distracted by the pain and the whole cycle that they're in. But this feeling goes all the way back to babyhood.
mm,
Um, and that idea was teased out by another author,
mm.
Sue Gerhardt, in her book, Why Love Matters, How Love Shapes a Baby's Brain.
Oh,
And she inspired me a lot with that particular idea of nature triggering something deep within us
mm,
that takes us back to that sense of calm, feeling connected, and
mm,
that sense of peace
mm,
and that joy.
mm,
And then in her book, she was talking about, from the ages of from day zero up until about 3 to 5 years of life, we have no control over what's in our living environment.
mm, mm, mm,
But love, or that the care that we receive from our caregivers,
mm,
or the absence of that,
mm, mm,
shapes our brain and influences in adulthood. And then when you look at chronic pain research, people that tend to be stuck in chronic pain have traumatic childhood experiences or traumatic experiences. So there's this particular association between the two.
yeah.
But the thing that really impressed me upon Sue Gerhardt's work is that think about a newborn baby.
Mm,
So we put a newborn baby and they're just placed on the crib by themselves. What's going to be happening for them right at that point in time?
mm.
They're going to be,
Lonely.
well, they don't know lonely per se. There's like, because they're going to be crying essentially. And if they're not crying, it's a medical emergency because we're talking about a newborn.
Mm,
Right?
mm, mm,
But no one taught the newborn baby to cry.
mm,
Right? It's like the obstetrician didn't hold up a cue card to say, okay, now you're out, you can cry.
mm,
It's an innate response.
mm,
But as soon as someone picks up that baby,
mm,
that feeling of being held,
mm,
and usually if it's a calm person, their heart rate's nice and slow, a smiley face and a calm voice, even though they can't see at that point, something changes with that little baby. And Sue Gerhard refers to it as the essence of regulation.
Mm.
And no one taught that baby to respond to those cues.
Mm.
And I come across a neuroscientist by the name of David Eagleman,
Mm.
and he uses a really good example or an analogy that when we're born, the brain is half baked.
Mm.
Then the other half gets cooked
Mm.
based on the incoming stimuli that happens, which is still outside of our control.
Mm. Mm.
So the association there is that a little baby that's on a table by itself, there's an absence of stimulation.
Mm.
And the brain is not receiving that stimulation. So it's going to release cortisol, which is our stress hormone, which is the true fight or flight response, because it's not a matter of if, it's
Mm.
a matter of when life will go out of that baby because it's completely helpless.
Mm.
Once the baby gets held,
Mm.
that's another stimulation. So that stimuli goes to the brain, it switches off cortisol,
Mm.
and then the oxytocin and then the endorphins and serotonin
Mm.
are then being released.
Mm.
And that turns off the cortisol, which then brings us into, or brings the baby back into that sense of calmness. And in that moment, that's what I refer to as the thriving state, because in that moment, nothing else matters for that baby.
Mm.
Whereas on the crib by itself, everything matters because it's helpless and potentially
Mm.
death is, imminent unless this happens. And that's based on the stimuli that the brain is picking up.
I love what you're saying. It's just explained so succinctly. So that innate thriving state is something that we have the
It's
capacity.
already within us.
Yeah,
Correct.
it's within us. And your job as a therapist and an author is to
Yes.
reestablish that innate thriving state for people. And I think, we're no longer babies. You're not talking to babies because they can't read. They can't understand.
Correct.
But, what happens with that little baby is that in its unbaked brain state, it requires stimulation to make sure that it knows that everything's okay. And part of that stimulation has to be that electromagnetic field because they come boom back into the heart of somebody who's rocking them. And there's a whole electromagnetic field that envelops them and makes them feel connected. And love being connection, connection being love. So there they are again, held. Now, when you get to our age and things have gone awry because they do, because trauma exists, and you're in physical and mental and perhaps spiritual pain, then how do you come back to that ITS I've already started to acronym it, internal
Yes.
thriving state. Yeah, innate thriving state, sorry. And one of the techniques, as shown on that beautiful cover of yours, is to go to nature because guess what? The earth and everything in it has also got that electromagnetic field and there is the capacity to connect. So I guess when in the absence of a pair of loving arms, there's nature.
And and nature seems to trigger it, provided that from babyhood
Mm.
there was that association that we were actually held
Mm.
and not smacked all the time.
Mm.
Um, Sue Gerhard referred to and I talk about this in the book also, to the Romanian orphanages. So this is going back in time, and based on the unrest in that country, and many children were left parentless. So they were in the orphanages, and when they were discovered, many of the little babies had died because there was no contact.
Mm.
Um, and those that survived,
Mm.
even though there was the context of help to try and get them back into a loving environment, it didn't happen. It was potentially useless. And when they looked at the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that develops with this connection after birth, was like a black hole there. So provided that we didn't have that experience, if
Mm.
we did, we wouldn't be talking to each other now because there's a critical period between 0 to 12 months of the baby being able to develop certain skills through this connection.
Mm.
So that neural pathway is there because it's in the part of the brain that's baked.
Mm.
That neural pathway, eventually what happens is little baby starts to grow and we get, good boy, that's how you're meant to do it. Or, no, that's not how you do it. Once upon a time, there was corporal punishment, or you're using negative, feedback to the person. Or,
Mm.
good girl, well done. This is how you do it. No, that's not how you do it. Now, what do you think the little child wants? Do
Mm.
they want that, yes, well done, or the, no, not, that's how you do it,
Mhm.
right? And
Primitive.
that's because the little child is now moving away from that thriving state to a reactive state to avoid punishment. And now some of those things would be helpful and others may not. But the point here is that they're based on someone else's belief systems. So it
Mm.
depends on what era you were born, what country you were born in, the cultural background, the religious background. All of these factors will then shape the uncooked part of the brain. And that part that was cooked is not being nurtured in the way that it could be.
Mm.
And um, trauma and it's interesting in the context of trauma. I refer to in my book to Edward Tonick back in the 70s. He was doing research. It's called the still face experiment.
Oh,
I'm not sure if you managed to see it or if you've been familiar with it, but um,
tragic. It's a horrible thing to do, that experiment. But yes, please.
well, the experiment was, for those who haven't seen it, is that you have a mother and a child is about 8 or 10 months old, and the mother's engaging,
Mm.
and then she's asked to turn away and then do this.
Mm.
And within 2 minutes, that baby that was engaging in a very happy way goes from being calm to hysterical.
Mm. Mm.
Now, that could be the mum needing to go to the toilet or having to go out and do something, but the baby doesn't know that.
Yes.
And, again, that just reinforced what David Eagleman was referring to, is that part of the brain that's already baked is waiting for a stimuli to come in. When
Mm.
that stimuli is not coming in, they go into the survival mode. And
Mm.
of course, as the baby develops, and this is really important for parents, when they know this, then you're able to incrementally, increase the distance between being with the child and not, but you're doing it in a particular way.
Mm.
Because he was referring to, this is Edward Tonick referring to, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is we're interacting and interactions are going well. The bad is, the mother is not interacting, but then comes back and regulates the child again.
Mm.
The ugly is when that regulation doesn't happen. And as you were mentioning before, as adults, that regulation may not happen as well as it could, particularly when we're stuck in chronic and living in environments that are not conducive to that wellness, or we're living in isolation. And this is really interesting too, because in my book, I refer to, the mechanisms behind how chronic pain develops. And one of the mechanisms is related to a neuropeptide called substance P. And that gets released. When I was learning acupuncture, they were talking about substance P would activate C fibers, which would continue the chronic pain process. But using needling would help to reduce that substance P release, as well as stimulate endorphin. So we start to get a decrease in pain transmission and reducing that, or breaking that cycle with the pain.
Mm. Mhm.
But substance P, interestingly, gets released in at the site also when we experience trauma or when we start to feel lonely or isolated.
Mm.
So people that are then in chronic pain, I've got a client that I'm seeing today. All his results are like negative, yet he's got this chronic pain that's been going for the last 3 years, more intense, but it's been there for at least 5 to 10 years. Now, I can only assume that his central mechanisms are wound up
Mm.
and he's become like a car alarm that is being triggered by a leaf falling on the car.
Mm.
So, and he's feeling isolated and alone. He's an elderly person, and
Mm. Mm.
I can only assume here that substance P is being released in bucket loads to be able to keep that whole pain cycle going. And then there's this idea, well, it's not an idea, there's another concept of stress-induced hyperalgesia. So you don't have to have trauma to have pain. But, long-term stress puts us into a state that increases our pain perception and pain transmission.
Mm.
And again, I talk about that in the book in a simplistic way to be able to make it understandable. Because once you have an understanding of the mechanism, they call it winding up. There is also a winding down process, and there's things that we can do. So the 10 activities that I list in my book all help towards that winding down process. But it goes back to what we were talking about, people being able to connect into that thriving state. And that's where I draw on the work of neuroplasticity and habit formation.
Mm.
Um,
Mm. Mm. It's a lot of work you're drawing on and bringing together for the novice here. It's fabulous. So yeah, so tell us a little bit about that. How do you get that? How do you explore what your initial thriving state is?
well, the first part is to become aware that one, we're already stuck in someone else's belief systems. That's where breaking beta, the term, came from. Actually, a client of mine that 5 years ago, before I had written the book, we went through a similar conversation about being able to reconnect to that underlying thriving state. And she emailed me quite excited. You can see the excitement in her email through her words that she finally recognized the unhealthy patterns that kept her stuck in her chronic pain, her anxiety, and in unhealthy relationships.
Mm.
So, and the term break, and she said that's her beta break. And beta break or breaking beta is a rock climbing term. So
Mm.
the beta or beta, depending on your pronunciation, I call it beta. Beta is in rock climbing competition, it's the route that the officials set. So the competitors climb that route as
Mm.
fast as they can to get to the top.
Mm.
Breaking beta means you see an alternate pathway to get to the top.
Mm.
So after our conversation, she saw, first of all, it became aware, but then she also became aware of an alternate pathway to get to where she wanted to go.
Mm.
So the idea here is once you become aware that there's an alternate pathway and why you're stuck is not entirely your fault because it was already preset back in babyhood, was outside of your control.
Mm.
That's where a bit of compassion and self-acceptance comes into it. You've got to, just accept that it's
Mm.
outside of your control. It's not you, uniquely you. Every single planet on planet Earth at day zero has no control.
Yes.
It's a bit of luck at one level, you could say, of where you end up.
Mm.
But
Mm.
once you become aware of that, then you can make a choice.
Mm.
Now, it's always hard to make a choice when you're in chronic pain. That's why I draw on Viktor Frankl's work because his work. Have you read his book, Man's Search for Meaning?
No, I don't think I have. I've read a bit of Viktor Frankl, but not that one.
Well, the quote that I was looking for was, everything can be taken away from a man or person
Mm.
except one thing, the last of the human freedoms. And that human freedom is our capacity to choose how we respond in any given situation.
Mm.
But most people are not responding, they're reacting, and they're in this cycle.
Mm.
So bringing in nature, again, getting a person to recall nature, it brings a little smile on their face. They don't see it, but I'm observing it and it's quite consistent. And then I bring in the idea of the baby, and
Mm.
then they start to understand, oh yeah, when I'm this, it's a thriving state, and that feeling that they get in nature. Because if you go back in time, when was the first time you had that experience? And go, I don't know. Oh man, when I was about 15. Well, you would have had to experience it before then, because it's like, for argument's sake, do you know what it feels like to get burnt if
Mm.
you've never been burnt?
Mm.
You have to have that experience. So, and it goes all the way back to babyhood. And then bringing back the idea that, well, that was a neural pathway already there. It was in the baked part of the brain that you didn't have access to. You were relying on your external environment to bring access to it.
Mm.
But despite what's happened, you just accessed it because you are able to go back in time to connect into that feeling. Because people go, "Oh, I'm feeling calmer." Well, how do you know to feel calm?
Yes.
How do you go there?
Yeah.
Well, did you no cue card necessary? I don't hold a cue card to go, all right, you're in nature. Now you can feel, calm, connected. They go, no, it just happens. No, it doesn't just happen. It's because it's already in that baked part of the brain. It's already there.
Yep.
And what nature's done is triggered it for you. Similarly, if you think about a time that you were successful at something,
Mm.
you've been working really hard, and finally, in that moment, you
Mm.
knew you achieved it. Now, in that moment, how do you feel?
Mm.
I'm asking you a question now, Kate. How do you feel in that moment when you know that you achieved something?
Exhilarated and relieved.
Relieved? And what was the first one?
Exhilarated, that feeling of I've done it, that
Yes,
full of strength and capacity. Yeah.
exactly. Now, how do you know to go there?
Because I've had it before, George, when
Exactly.
I
And when was the first time you had it?
goodness only knows. I think that probably when my mother or whoever it was said, "Well done, that's fabulous."
Exactly. So, and it keeps going all the way back to babyhood. Because in that moment, when you look at your energy levels, do they drop or do they go up?
Well, up.
They go up. When you look at, say, your cognition and your ability to make decisions, do they drop down or do they go up?
Up.
They go up. Your ability to, say, be empathy, does it drop down or does your empathy go up?
Also up. You become
Exactly.
a broader, bigger creature when you're in that state.
And that's already within us. That is the neural state that's in that baked part of the brain. That's the actual underlying human trait.
Yes.
Someone came in to me and says, George, I believe I'm open to this stuff. And I said, you actually told me you're closed. I said, the natural human trait is actually to be open, to be connecting, to be loving, to be caring. It's
Mm.
our belief systems that close us off.
Mm. Yeah. And that's been really interesting. I mean, I've read your book and I love it, which is why you're here being interviewed.
Yes.
One of the things that I really came away with, because I've been suffering a certain health condition, and I realized that I was doing the beta path, this is do. Instead of going into my own capacity and going, I can choose how to react to this, and I can actually choose a completely different pathway. And it's just the concept of what you've put in there. As a Greek, I guess,
Yeah.
the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, the alphabet, there's beta, there's alpha. Well, I grew up in Greece too. And so I was like, beta state, that means there's an alpha state. Okay, what's that? And so that self-questioning of I'll make those decisions, thank you, has really been quite an eye-opener. So thanks.
Oh, I'm glad that's the whole intention, because I haven't really seen you as a client and writing the books, like how do you get that message across to someone
Mm.
that you can't then, interact with? And
Mm.
that's where, like, my first activity is connecting to nature. The second activity is that aspect of compassion and self-acceptance. And the third is then the success,
Mm. Mm.
which then that gives that person that ability to tune into that and then becoming aware that feeling is already in you and then going, well, imagine if that feeling, you're in that thriving state where you have that sense of joy, that sense of connection. Imagine being that being your dominating neural pathway, how you filter everything coming in you through that pathway.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
just like
It's gold. It
it
is.
is gold. It's the nugget already within us. I was listening to Sadhguru. He goes, the only way out is in, and he's talking about it in a particular way. But I believe that the in is that thriving state because it's already that capacity within us to be in that state. But chronic pain puts us into, or the suffering of pain, the suffering of our emotions puts that all the way. I use like a little
Mm.
cable, right? That's the thickness of our thriving state. The room is our survival state, right?
Mm.
We need our survival state if someone, is threatening our lives, we're going to die in this minute, we want that system to kick in. But if we're perceiving that, everything's bad and we're going to die, well, it's kicking in unnecessarily. And this gets put under. I actually got a bin and several weights, and this I put under the carpet, and then I throw all the weights into the bin to go, well, this is you right now, and you're reacting. And the things that you do, all right, you might go and take your supplement, or you might go and do meditation, or you'll do yoga, or you go and have a pharmaceutical. You're doing that to release the pain from what you're experiencing. But what we're missing is this. So then I uncover everything, and then I bring this out and go, this is within you.
Come to the innate thriving self.
State, yes. And the idea is that breaking beat is that, well, you can see this here now. So you can find an alternate pathway. I'm not taking away the other pathway from you, because that's a really strong pathway. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it for any person. When you're in chronic pain, you don't have the environment to be supportive. It's going to be much harder to do this. If you're going back into an environment where you're being bashed, well, it's going to be much harder to reach into this. You got to stop that. So provided those things are not happening, then you have the possibility to be here.
Yeah.
And then I show them what my son, when he was in grade 4, he's now doing VCE, he brought home, they were doing growth mindset, and we had to look at with them little video clips. And there was one by Centis. I referenced it in the book, and it's about neuroplasticity. And it is very easy to understand. And it just then reinforces the point that goes, well, every time we think, feel, or do, we're strengthening the neural pathway. So every time I say, I'm sick, I've got a headache, oh, Friday, it's the end of the week, I'm going to feel tired. Well, you're just strengthening that neural pathway. When my son was in prep, I would hear consistently, oh, it's the end of the term, they're going to be tired, or the end of the week, they're going to be tired. Kids are not tired. It's the belief system of someone else. And I was there for over 100 days, because they awarded me 100 days in prep as a parent. So that was a very nice thing to receive. But this neural pathway, based on that video, with repeated and directed attention towards your desired outcome, you can rewire your brain. But I'm not talking about rewiring the brain. I'm talking about reconnecting to something and making it stronger, because it's already within you. This is not about positive thinking and say, I'm going to use the word bullshitting to yourself that I'm not in pain. Yes, you're in pain, but our perceptions of pain can either amplify it or decrease it. The research is quite clear. I mentioned a research article in the book where they used a very cold rod with minus 36 or something. And they had a red light and a blue light, and they geared up the subjects to go, the red light will be hotter and cause pain, and the blue light will be cooler and cause less pain. But the trick here was that the rod never changed. Yet the people that saw the red light felt more pain, and the people that saw the blue light felt less pain. And these are the same subjects.
A beautiful, eloquent example of just how prone we are, to hearing and learning and getting a scaffolding and being taught, and how much we have to unteach ourselves in order to relearn from the inside out. Yeah.
Correct. And then with that little video, with repeated and directed attention towards the desired outcome. So there are 3 things there. The desired outcome is not, oh, I'm overweight, I want to lose weight. I'm in pain, I want to reduce pain. Yes, that's the reactive outcome. We don't want you to be in pain. You need to have a healthy body weight. But that's not the desired outcome from the way that I'm looking at it. This, where we're in that state of thriving, that's the desired outcome. And then when that's the strongest neural pathway, you have no idea what your potential is. I have no idea what my potential is until this is my dominating neural pathway.
Mm, mm,
And that's when, well, we're repeated and directed attention. Well, how many repetitions do you have to do? And this is where I bring in habit formation research. And that's where it takes anywhere from 18 to 254 days to create a habit. And that's based on research that I cite in the book also. And that's just doing one cue,
mm,
because a habit, you've got to have a cue.
mm,
You put the desired outcome that you want in it, associate it with the cue, and then there's a reward at the end of it. And then you keep creating that habit cycle until it becomes automated.
mm,
And they were doing it with one cue. I'm suggesting using 5 cues, and a cue is something that happens despite us. So waking up in the morning is a cue.
mm, mm,
Going to bed is a cue. So I'm asking people to think about that thriving state
mm,
on waking, because if you don't wake up, well, it's the end of the game. Who knows what the next journey is, you know? But if you do wake up, well, make that the first thing you look at.
mm,
Before going to bed,
mm.
that's another thing. Even if you're an insomniac, eventually you'll go to bed and sleep. It's impossible to not to sleep for 10 days, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So eventually you'll go to sleep. So you can use it there.
Mm,
But, and I choose those two pathways to begin with is because our brainwave is in what they refer to as the alpha state, which is again coincidental with my alpha phase testing process,
mm,
but it's the alpha waves. And we're more likely to be able to tune into that feeling. And then I come across a bit of research that also demonstrates that it can also help with pain transmission.
mm,
So first thing in the morning, last thing at night, excuse me. And then I've created a little process called the 6 steps to CREATE
mm,
to create that, if you spell it out, the acronym.
mm,
So the C is to the Q, so the morning. The R is recall, which is the first activity in the book, which is nature.
mm,
CRE is to enrich that feeling using success, because nature and that feeling of success is still that thriving state over here. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Goes back to babyhood. In that moment, nothing else mattered for that baby.
mm,
Then the CREA, the A is to affirm. And I borrowed this from Sadhguru. Every time he talks, he's the Indian mystic. Every time he talks to audiences, and he gets a lot of people. I went to see him in Sydney, and it's amazing how many people he's attracting, but he's got this underlying message. How do you choose to experience life?
mm,
Pleasantly or unpleasantly? Make a choice now and I'll bless you, right? That's his underlying thing. But when he talks about life, it's not living, making money or your family or anything like that. That's why I make a distinction between living and life in the book. He's talking about life processes, which is nature. How do you choose to experience nature? The oxygen we breathe, the trees that we see, the gravity that keeps us on Earth,
mm.
right? Pleasantly or unpleasantly. So
Yeah.
collectively, those three things come together to create a feeling.
Mm,
And then I did a course on positive neuroplasticity with Rick Hanson, who's an American psychologist. And
mm,
he also inspired me about positive neuroplasticity.
mm,
I got from him that you can spend up to 10 seconds to try and help to start to shift the amygdala from being in that survival state and wind it down a little bit.
mm,
And some of his research and reading is pointing that that's a possibility. So
mm,
he talks about breathing it in. So you breathe in the positive, but I'm talking about breathing in that aspect of nature and soaking every cell in your body with it. You were talking about before the dendrites and the hair being receptors. Well, every cell in your body is a receptor,
mm,
and it's bringing in information. And I'm not sure if you've read, I can't remember the lady's name, the first heart lung transplant lady in the States. And she received the heart and lungs
mm.
of someone that was anonymous.
Yes, yes, I have.
And
It's some
it happened to be a young boy who was in a motorbike accident. But the interesting thing was that she was picking up on his signals, or the signals that are there. And she started to attract men towards her and walked in a particular way and liked eating nuggets. And her story, unfolds. She finds the family of the boy, and there were the habits of him. So
Mm.
it was interesting that, the cells are receiving information and giving out. So what do you want your cells to receive? The information coming from within you. So you're soaking it in,
Yeah.
and then you're distributing it out through you evenly, and then out into your environment. And
Mhm.
then you finish the E with I feel fine. But you got to do that breathing in and out at least 10 seconds, which I borrow from Rick Hanson's work, that a minimum of 10 seconds, but
Mm.
he breaks it as a minimum of 10 minutes
Mm.
to focus on it.
Mm.
So that creates the create cycle. And if you do that twice a day to begin with, it's achievable because it's 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes at night. And
Yeah.
then you build up to 10 minutes. And then you can build up more as I take the person through that process, which I refer as alpha phase testing, which is I borrow from computer programming.
And eventually you just want to do it all the time, I imagine, because you realize that you can switch on or switch off that flicking switch.
Well,
And
it's more than imagining it. It
mm,
happens because habit formation, automaticity takes over,
mm,
and neuroplasticity happens.
yeah,
It's already happening to everyone.
mm,
People can recall bad traumatic experiences easily. You only need a little smell of it and you're in it.
yes,
That's neuroplasticity. That's habit formation.
yes.
Unfortunately, survival mode gets triggered off much, much, much easier than the thriving mode, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective because we want to stay alive. We want to avoid danger. So hunter-gatherers, you want to be aware of the dangers per se.
But it also comes down, doesn't it, to millennia of trauma that we've brought down onto each other and what we've taught each other about. It's really tough out here. We'll need to do all of these things to survive. So do not teach your boy child, for example, to laugh and jump and play. Teach them to be damn serious and work hard and, cut off from joy and don't cry and don't feel and, all of the things that we teach. I wonder, I'm just going to open this up because I'm aware of the time and I'm just going to see whether Martine would like to weigh in on any of what we've been talking about.
Yes, that was fascinating chat. Thank you so much, George. I mean,
Oh,
there's so much in there that you put, and your book must be so exciting. I mean, the power of love, the power of nature, the power of we always have a choice. Like internally, we can decide how we respond and what perception we need to choose. I had a beautiful experience many, many years ago. I was with a friend for her first baby at the birth, and she had very intense pain, like she called it that missing pain. It's painful. And I said, it's not pain, it's just an extreme sensation of life coming through. And so she changed the perception and then she could cope with the pain much better. She was anticipating this baby coming out. So the power we have to really shift the energy is unbelievable. So, and that's, we need to really teach that and educate people that they have this tuning in power and choosing that different way of experiencing life. So yeah, so much in there. It's beautiful.
I think,
Thank you so much.
Martine, you're just so right. Then how do we start by teaching everybody that life is joy and love and connection instead of the opposite?
Yeah,
mm.
yeah,
And,
and
and
the
and the
power of
context
love.
is, yeah, well,
Yeah,
it's and not just teaching that, it's bringing awareness of that. And that's
yes,
where nature
yes,
is that starting point. Because as
yes,
I've shared, even the person in the most difficult situation, when they allow themselves and make that choice to choose to tune into it and recall, even if
yep,
it was 20 years ago, this
yep,
happens.
yep,
That's the
yep,
start. And once you
yeah,
can capture that, then
yeah,
you're able to then take them through that process. But it's repeated and directed attention. They have to
yeah,
keep doing it. And that's where the
yep,
support comes in to be able to
definitely,
keep doing it until it becomes automated.
yep,
And for
yep.
some people, it's going to be easier than others, but the possibility is there. Unless you had the Romanian orphanage experience, then
Yes,
unfortunately that's cut off. That
yeah,
critical period is gone, and you wouldn't be
yeah,
here talking about it or, in your chronic pain.
yeah, of course,
Yeah.
yeah.
It,
We,
it,
we, we're so powerful. We have no idea how powerful we are.
mm.
Yeah,
We really don't. And, like, I'm just so excited to be here with you in this community because I think we've only just begun. What we know to be true through all these years of alpha testing.
Yes. Well, well, it's all the beta phase testing. The alpha testing starts when you become aware that you
Mm.
have a thriving state and you're able to work towards that. And there'll be betas that are quite useful for you, and there are betas that are not useful for you. But it's just recognizing you start off with that one pathway that's already within you, and you start strengthening it, even just with waking up in the morning, going back to, before going to bed, starting with the CREAT process, those 6 steps to create, and you keep doing that, keep doing it, and then go into nature. But before
Yeah.
you go into nature, go through the steps. So you're self-empowering, you're self-starting that feeling rather than going, I've got to go into nature to feel that feeling. When you go into nature, it's going to self-trigger itself anyway. But you want to
Yeah.
do it consciously, not subconsciously.
And as you said, nature can be patting your cat. That can be nature, you know. It can
Yeah,
be making love to another living being. It can be saying hello to your pot plant. It can be whatever that is, George.
exactly.
Easily accessible once you know how. And your book is just fabulous in terms of helping people know how. It's just, it breaks it down to such a simplistic, beautiful system, which you've, thank you, Mother Hen, taken in, digested for us and laid this golden egg. So I want to thank you for everything that you've done. And I'm sure that people will pick up from this video your incredible enthusiasm to make a better, help people better themselves and to help
Yes,
the world become better. So, boy, oh boy, we could talk all day and all
we
night,
could.
but I've got to carry on. I've got to take the compost from the local shop down to the local garden, and someone's waiting for me there. So life goes on,
It
and
does.
what we can.
And I'm glad that you got that from the book, because that was the whole intention. So I'm so grateful that you were able to share that with me, because as an author, the intention was exactly what you were I'm hearing back from you. So that was thank you for that. And thank you, Martine, for joining us today too. It's
Pleasure. It was
greatly
a great
appreciated.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, the inspiration is palpable, George, in that book.
Yeah.
I defy anyone to read that book and not walk away thinking, I could do this. So carry on, everyone. Thank you, George. And let's just keep building this picture together.
Yeah.